What if the world you knew was always at war, and your place in it was decided before you even drew your first breath? Imagine a time way back in 730, Anno Domini, when a woman's life was a maze of unwritten laws and strict expectations. Were you even allowed to walk outside your home without a male guardian? Could you ever hope to own land or speak your mind in a public square? Get ready to peel back the layers of history and discover the astonishing truths about the lives of women in the tumultuous Byzantine Borderlands, a place where every day was a fight for survival, and the rules were ironclad. Number 11. Restriction on political influence and succession. In the rugged, ever-shifting landscape of the Byzantine Borderlands during the early 8th century, the machinery of power was overwhelmingly, even ferociously, masculine. This wasn't just a matter of tradition. It was a deeply ingrained aspect of a society that prized military strength, administrative prowess, and dynastic continuity through male lines above almost all else. For women, regardless of their social standing, direct political influence, or the right to succeed to positions of significant authority beyond their own immediate family's private property, was, for all intents and purposes, a non-existent concept. The very idea would have struck most Byzantines as preposterous, even dangerous, undermining the fundamental order of their world. Imagine a young woman, perhaps named Theodora, growing up in a prosperous estate near the eastern frontier, perhaps in a town like Amorium, a strategic stronghold constantly under threat from the advancing Umayyad Caliphate. Her father, a local magnate or military commander, would spend his days in council, managing the defenses, overseeing the local economy, and adjudicating disputes. Theodora, no matter how intelligent or capable, would be completely excluded from these discussions. She might overhear whispers, glean information from servants, or even be privy to her father's frustrations, but she would never be invited to offer her opinion, let alone participate in the decision-making process. Public sphere, the arena of governance, military strategy, and legal pronouncements, was a man's domain, walled off by centuries of custom and the pragmatic demands of a frontier existence. Even for women of the highest echelons of Byzantine society, like empresses or powerful noblewomen in Constantinople, their influence was often exerted indirectly through their husbands, sons, or male relatives. They might be patrons of churches, engage in charitable works, or even conspire behind the scenes, but the formal structures of power, the imperial court, the military command, the church hierarchy, were closed to them. In the Borderlands, this restriction was amplified by the constant state of vigilance and conflict. Leadership here demanded physical presence, military acumen, and the ability to command respect in a harsh environment. These were qualities conventionally attributed to men. A woman, even one with a keen mind for strategy or a deep understanding of local politics, would not be seen as a legitimate leader in a community perpetually on guard against raids or sieges. Her role was primarily domestic, focused on the household, the spiritual well-being of the family, and the production of heirs, particularly male ones, who could continue the family line and inherit its responsibilities. This was not merely about exclusion from formal roles. It was about a fundamental societal belief that women, by their nature, were not suited for the rigors of public life, especially in a region where such life was synonymous with warfare and constant negotiation of power. Historical accounts, though scarce in specific details for every border community, consistently portray a patriarchal system where authority flowed from father to son, from general to subordinate, and where women's voices, if heard at all in the political sphere, were filtered through male intermediaries. The idea of a woman inheriting a military command, leading a delegation to negotiate with a neighboring chieftain, or even holding a municipal office, was simply outside the realm of possibility in 730 Anno Domini in the Byzantine Borderlands. Their potential, however great, was confined to the domestic, a sphere considered vital yet entirely separate from the public and political realms. This societal division was not a mere suggestion. It was an unwritten, deeply enforced rule, shaping the destinies of every woman in this unforgiving landscape. Number 10. Restriction on inter-ethnic or inter-religious marriage. In the volatile melting pot of the Byzantine Borderlands, in 730 Anno Domini, the concept of marriage was not just about two individuals uniting. It was a powerful tool of social cohesion, political alliance, and the preservation of identity. This was particularly true when it came to unions between people of different ethnicities or, even more critically, different religious faiths. For women, these restrictions were often the most profound, carrying immense social and legal ramifications. The Byzantine Empire was at its heart a Christian empire, specifically Orthodox Christian. Its constant adversary in the Eastern Borderlands was the powerful Umayyad Caliphate, which was Muslim. The fault lines of faith were not just theological, they were jilting, military, and deeply personal. Marrying across this religious divide was not merely frowned upon, it was largely seen as an act of treason against one's community, one's faith, and the very fabric of Byzantine identity. Imagine the plight of a young woman perhaps named Eudoxia from a small Byzantine town in Cappadocia, a region frequently raided and disputed. Her family's loyalty to the emperor and the Orthodox Church was paramount. If she were to, against all odds, fall in love with a young man from a nearby Arab settlement, perhaps a trader or even a soldier on the other side of the volatile frontier, their union would be considered an unthinkable transgression. The social pressure would be immense, enforced by family, church, and local authorities. The young man, if he wished to marry her, would likely be expected to convert to Christianity, and even then he would be viewed with suspicion. For Eudoxia, the consequences of marrying a Muslim man without his conversion would be dire. She would be ostracized, disowned, and perhaps even considered legally dead to her family. Children would almost certainly be raised as Muslims, a catastrophic loss for the Byzantine community. This restriction was enforced not just by social custom, but by legal pronouncements. While Byzantine law had some flexibility in certain matters, when it came to religious purity, especially in the context of the perennial struggle against Islam, the lines were drawn sharply. The threat of apostasy, of leaving the Christian faith, was considered one of the gravest offenses. Women, seen as the bearers of culture and the first educators of children, were particularly important in maintaining religious continuity. Allowing a woman to marry outside the faith, especially to a non-Christian, was perceived as a direct assault on the community's spiritual and demographic future. Moreover, inter-ethnic marriages, even between Christian groups, could be complex. While internal marriages between different Byzantine ethnic groups were common unions with those from outside the empire's cultural sphere, even if Christian might still face scrutiny, especially in the sensitive border regions where loyalty could be questioned. A woman from a Greek-speaking Byzantine family marrying into an Armenian or Slavic community, for example, might face challenges related to property rights, customs, and integration, though these were generally less severe than religious divides. However, the most profound restriction was always religious. The spiritual leaders, the local priests and bishops, played a significant role in enforcing these norms, reminding their congregations of the sanctity of Christian marriage and the perils of unions with unbelievers. In the Borderlands, where the Byzantine identity was constantly challenged by the proximity of different cultures and faiths, these rules were amplified. They were not merely legal codes, but deep-seated societal convictions, shaping family decisions, individual choices, and the very composition of communities, effectively sealing off women from seeking partners beyond the rigid confines of their religious. This invisible wall around a woman's marital options was one of the most powerful and defining restrictions of her existence in 730 Anno Domini. Number 9. Restriction on religious roads and authority. For women living in the Byzantine Borderlands in 730 Anno Domini, the path to spiritual fulfillment and community contribution was deeply woven into the tapestry of the Orthodox Christian Church. However, While their faith was paramount and their piety often celebrated, their access to positions of authority and formal religious leadership was virtually non-existent. The spiritual landscape, much like the political and military ones, was overwhelmingly a male domain. Women, like their male counterparts, were expected to attend church services, observe fasts, receive sacraments, and live a life of devout adherence to Christian principles. Their homes were centers of private devotion, where icons were venerated and prayers were recited. Women often played a crucial role in raising their children in the faith, teaching them prayers and instilling moral values. Yet, when it came to the formal structure of the church, the doors to power were closed. No woman could be a priest, a bishop, or a patriarch. They could not administer sacraments, preach from the pulpit during divine liturgy, or make theological pronouncements that held official weight. Imagine a woman, perhaps named Irene, living in a mountain village in Anatolia, a place where the local church was the spiritual and social heart of the community. Irene might be deeply learned in scripture, possess profound wisdom, and be a source of spiritual guidance for her neighbors, offering comfort and counsel. She might even be seen as a holy woman, a local ascetic, or a visionary. However, despite her spiritual gifts, she could never stand at the altar and perform the sacred rites, never offer communion or hear confessions as a priest would. Her influence would always be informal, operating within the boundaries of her gendered role. The only formal religious path open to women seeking a life dedicated to God was monasticism. Women could become nuns, residing in convents, where they lived lives of asceticism, prayer, study, and charitable work. These convents often served as centers of learning and spiritual refuge, especially in the borderlands, where they sometimes provided sanctuary during raids. An abbess, the head of a convent, held significant authority within her own community of nuns, managing the convent's affairs, guiding her sisters, and sometimes even managing vast estates. However, even an abbess's authority was confined to her female community and subject to the oversight of male bishops and patriarchs. She could not participate in church councils that shaped doctrine or policy, nor could she exert direct influence over the broader male-dominated ecclesiastical hierarchy. Her power was specific and circumscribed. The theological foundations for this exclusion were rooted in interpretations of Scripture and early Christian tradition, which designated certain roles, particularly the priesthood, as exclusively male. This was tied to the idea of the priest acting in the person of Christ, who was male, and to the traditional patriarchal structure of society at large. In the borderlands, where adherence to tradition and spiritual stability were seen as vital for maintaining morale and identity against external threats, these gendered religious roles were likely reinforced with even greater vigor. Any challenge to the established order, even in the spiritual realm, could be perceived as a weakness in the face of the enemy. Thus, while women's piety was lauded and their spiritual contributions acknowledged within their prescribed spheres, the formal structures of religious authority remained firmly beyond their reach, a pervasive and limiting rule of their existence in 730 Anno Domini. Number 8. Restriction on military participation and defense. Life in the Byzantine Borderlands in 730 Anno Domini was a constant interplay of vigilance raids and the ever-present threat of full-scale invasion. Military prowess was the bedrock of survival, and every aspect of society was in some way oriented towards defense. In this martial environment, the roles of men and women were sharply delineated, with military participation and direct defense falling squarely into the male domain. For women, this meant a profound restriction on their ability to directly engage in combat, even when their homes and communities were under direct assault. Imagine a fortified village on the eastern frontier, perhaps in Cilicia, a region frequently targeted by Umayyad raiding parties. When the watchman spotted enemy horsemen on the horizon, a frantic alarm would be sounded. Men, young and old, Farmers and craftsmen alike would grab their spears, bows, or whatever makeshift weapons they possessed and scramble to the palisades or the tower. Women, however, were not expected to join them on the ramparts. Their role, while crucial, was different. They would be herded into the safest parts of the village, perhaps the underground cisterns or the sturdy stone houses, tasked with protecting the children, tending to the wounded if the walls were breached, and perhaps boiling water or preparing stones to drop on attackers from a distance, if they were lucky enough to be in a position to do so from a secure location. The idea of a woman donning armor, carrying a sword, and fighting shoulder to shoulder with men was simply alien to the Byzantine conception of warfare. Military training, physical conditioning for combat, and the brutal exclusives of the battlefield were considered exclusively the purview of men. This was not to say women were entirely passive in times of conflict, far from it. In many frontier communities, women played a vital indirect role in defense. They might operate the village grinding stones to prepare food for the defenders, repair clothing, help maintain defensive structures, or even assist in moving supplies and water to those fighting. During sieges, their resilience and ability to endure hardship were crucial for community survival. There are rare, almost mythical accounts of women taking up arms in extremis, perhaps during a desperate last stand when all men had fallen. But these were exceptions that proved the rule, typically presented as acts of extraordinary desperation rather than accepted practice. These stories highlight the extremity of the situation rather than a deviation from the gendered roles. Furthermore, women were often the primary victims of raids and invasions, being enslaved or captured, which only reinforced the male role as their protectors and the need for women to be shielded from direct conflict. The expectation was that men would defend their families and communities, while women would retreat to safety and preserve the lineage. This societal division was rooted in a combination of biological differences, prevailing cultural norms about masculinity and femininity, and the pragmatic realities of a harsh frontier environment where physical strength and a warrior ethos were prized above all else. For women, this meant their physical security, and often their very survival was dependent on the fighting capabilities of the men around them, a heavy and unyielding restriction that shaped their lives in the perpetually embattled Byzantine Borderlands of 730 Anno Domini. They were vital to the survival of the community, but their contribution was defined by support and resilience, not direct combat. Number 7. Restriction on legal standing and representation in the intricate and often intimidating legal landscape of the Byzantine Empire in 730 Anno Domini. A woman's ability to navigate the courts, assert her rights, or even manage her own affairs was severely constrained by the deeply entrenched requirement for male guardianship and representation. While Byzantine law inherited from its Roman predecessors did grant women certain rights, such as the right to own property, inherit, and even initiate divorce under specific circumstances, the practical exercise of these rights was almost invariably funneled through a male intermediary. This wasn't just a matter of social etiquette. It was a fundamental legal principle that profoundly limited a woman's agency in the public and legal spheres. Imagine a woman, perhaps named Helena, living in a trading post near the Syrian border. Her husband, a merchant, has been tragically killed in a raid, leaving her with their children and a small inheritance. While legally Helena might be the rightful inheritor of his assets, she would find herself in a precarious position. If she needed to sell a piece of land, enter into a contract, pursue a debt owed to her late husband, or defend herself against a claim, she could not simply walk into the local magistrate's court and represent herself. She would need a male guardian or representative, often a father, brother, uncle, or even an appointed male proxy, to act on her behalf. This guardian would speak for her, sign documents, and manage the legal complexities. While he was ostensibly there to protect her interests, this system inherently placed her in a position of dependency, stripping her of direct control over her legal and financial destiny. The rationale behind this system was rooted in the prevailing patriarchal view of society. Women were considered more vulnerable, less rational, and generally unsuited for the rigors of public life and legal proceedings. In the Byzantine Borderlands, where communities were often isolated, legal structures might be less robust, and the threat of lawlessness was ever present. This dependence on a male guardian could be even more pronounced. In such an environment, a woman without a strong male protector was in an even more precarious situation, vulnerable to exploitation, and unable to effectively defend her own interests. Moreover, the type of legal cases women could pursue or be involved in were often limited. While they could certainly be victims of crimes or parties in domestic disputes, their involvement in broader commercial or public legal matters was rare, and almost always through a male proxy. The very concept of a female lawyer or a female judge was entirely outside the social and legal norms of the time. Even in matters of inheritance, where women could certainly receive property, their ability to manage or dispose of it independently might be restricted by a requirement for their guardian's consent. This legal dependency was not a benevolent protection, it was a powerful control mechanism, ensuring that women's lives, even their financial and property matters, remained largely under male supervision. For women in the Byzantine Borderlands of 730 Anno Domini, navigating the legal world meant accepting their status as perpetual minors, relying on male figures to speak for them and represent their interest, a clear and undeniable limitation on their autonomy. Number 6. Restriction on education and public life for women residing in the Byzantine Borderlands of 730 Anno Domini. The avenues to formal education and meaningful participation in public life were severely constrained. While the Byzantine Empire was one of the most sophisticated societies of its time, boasting centers of learning in Constantinople, these opportunities were largely the preserve of men, particularly those destined for religious, administrative, or legal careers. For the vast majority of women, especially in the rugged and often isolated frontier regions, formal schooling as we understand it was virtually non-existent. Imagine a young woman, perhaps named Sophia, growing up in a prosperous but remote village in eastern Anatolia. Her brothers might attend a local monastery school, where they would learn to read and write Greek, study scripture, and perhaps some basic arithmetic. Sophia, however, would likely receive her education within the confines of her home. Her mother and elder female relatives would teach her essential domestic skills, managing a household, preparing food, spinning wool into thread, perhaps basic mending of clothing, and caring for children. She would also learn about Christian piety, prayers, and stories from the Bible. This practical domestic education was considered entirely sufficient for her expected role as a wife and mother. Intellectual pursuits beyond rudimentary literacy, if even that, were not encouraged, nor were there readily available institutions for women to pursue them. There were, of course, very rare exceptions. Some aristocratic women in the capital might receive a private education, learning to read and write or even engaging with classical literature. However, these were isolated cases, not representative of the lives of women in the borderlands. Even for these highly educated women, their intellectual accomplishments did not translate into access to public life. Public sphere, the forum, the marketplace, the courts, the administrative offices, the military, was a man's world. Women were generally expected to remain unseen and unheard in these arenas. Their presence, if required, was typically limited to the periphery or entirely absent. A woman could not hold public office, serve on a council, or participate in public debates. She could not deliver speeches or conduct business negotiations independently in the marketplace. Even attending certain public gatherings might be considered inappropriate or even dangerous for a respectable woman. In the borderlands, these restrictions were often intensified by the prevailing conditions. Communities were smaller, often more conservative, and constantly focused on survival. The emphasis was on maintaining traditional roles that contributed directly to the community's resilience. Education for girls was seen as a luxury that diverted from essential domestic and religious training. Public life was about men defending the community, administering justice, and engaging in external affairs, roles deemed unsuitable for women. Thus, for women in the Byzantine Borderlands of 730 Anno Domini, the opportunities for formal education were incredibly scarce, and the doors to public life were firmly shut, leaving them with an existence largely confined to the private realm of the household and immediate family. Number 5. Restriction on divorce and remarriage. In the Byzantine Borderlands of 730 Anno Domini, the institution of marriage was deeply intertwined with religious doctrine, social stability, and the continuity of families in a perpetually uncertain environment. While Byzantine law, drawing from its Roman heritage, did allow for divorce, the process was far from straightforward, particularly for women, and remarriage often carried significant social and legal complexities. For women, seeking a divorce was an especially arduous journey, reflecting a societal bias that privileged the stability of the marital union above individual desire. Imagine a woman named Maria, married to a farmer in a small Byzantine outpost in southern Anatolia. Perhaps her husband is abusive, or he has become infertile, or perhaps he has committed a grave offense, like adultery or plotting against the emperor. While Byzantine law listed several legitimate grounds for a woman to initiate a divorce, such as her husband's impotence, prolonged absence, or certain criminal convictions, the burden of proof lay heavily on her. She would need compelling evidence, often difficult to obtain in a conservative and isolated community, and male family members to support her case in court. The process could be lengthy, expensive, and socially stigmatizing. Unlike men, who had more avenues and fewer social repercussions for initiating divorce, a woman pursuing one was often viewed with suspicion, regardless of the validity of her claims. Her reputation could suffer, impacting her family's standing and her own future prospects. Even if a divorce was successfully obtained, the path to remarriage for a woman was fraught with additional challenges. While the Church generally permitted remarriage after a legitimate divorce or the death of a spouse, it frowned upon multiple marriages, particularly for women. A woman who remarried too quickly or too many times might be seen as impious or morally loose, impacting her social acceptance. For widows, remarriage was common, especially for younger women, as it provided security and economic stability. However, the Church often imposed penances for second and third marriages, viewing the first sanctified union as the ideal. For those who had children from a previous marriage, remarriage could complicate property, inheritance, custody, and the future of their offspring, especially if the new husband was not well regarded or if there were disputes over dowries and dower rights. In the Borderlands, where stability and continuity were paramount for survival, the pressure to maintain a marriage, even a difficult one, might have been even greater. Dissolutions of marriage could disrupt family alliances, economic arrangements, and the social fabric of small communities. The Church, a powerful moral authority in these regions, would consistently advocate for the indissolubility of marriage, emphasizing its sacred nature. While not an absolute prohibition, the numerous legal hurdles, social stigmas, and religious reservations surrounding divorce and remarriage created significant barriers for women in the Byzantine Borderlands of 730 Anno Domini. Their ability to escape an unhappy or dysfunctional marriage or to forge a new life after its end was severely curtailed by a society that placed the stability of the family and the sanctity of the first union above the individual woman's desires or needs. Number 4. Restriction on choice of marriage partner. For women living in the Byzantine Borderlands during 730 Anno Domini, the concept of freely choosing one's marriage partner was largely an alien notion. Marriages were almost without exception arranged affairs, driven by a complex web of social, economic, political, and dynastic considerations, rather than individual affection or preference. For women, this meant their future was often decided by their male relatives, typically their father, long before they reached an age where they might even begin to contemplate such a life-altering decision. Imagine a young woman named Alara, growing up in a substantial landowning family in a strategically important town near the eastern frontier, perhaps in Mesopotamia, constantly at risk from Arab incursions. Her marriage would not be about her personal happiness, but about consolidating family wealth, forging alliances with other powerful families, or even securing military support for her community. Her father might arrange her marriage to the son of a neighboring general, or a wealthy merchant, or even a local administrator. The goal was to strengthen the family's position, secure its property, and ensure its survival in a precarious environment. Alara's feelings on the matter would hold little to no weight. She would be expected to accept her father's choice as her duty to her family and to God. This practice was deeply rooted in Byzantine society. A woman's dowry, the property or wealth she brought into the marriage, was a crucial part of the negotiation, and it directly influenced the suitability of potential matches. For families in the borderlands, marriage could also serve as a vital tool for social cohesion. Intermarriage between prominent families could solidify local power structures, create networks of mutual support, and even contribute to the defense of the region by binding influential individuals together. Church, while emphasizing the importance of consent in marriage and condemning forced unions, largely deferred to parental authority in the selection of spouses, considering it part of the natural order. However, the consent typically referred to was a formal affirmation, rather than an expression of true choice. A woman was expected to consent to her father's choice, understanding that her defiance would bring shame upon her family and potentially jeopardize their standing. There were certainly cases where a woman might express a strong aversion to a particular match, and perhaps her family might relent if another equally suitable option was available. But the fundamental control over the choice of partner lay with the male head of the household. For some women, the only alternative to an arranged marriage was to enter a convent and become a nun, dedicating their lives to God. This provided a degree of autonomy over their bodies and spiritual lives, but it also meant renouncing the traditional path of marriage and motherhood. While it might have been seen as an escape from an undesirable match, it was still a path chosen under specific societal constraints, not a free choice of lifestyle in the modern sense. The societal pressure to marry and bear children, particularly male heirs, was immense, especially in the borderlands where population stability and the continuation of family lines were crucial for community survival. Therefore, the ability of a woman to select her own husband was virtually non-existent in the Byzantine borderlands of 730 Anno Domini. Her fate was largely predetermined by her family's needs and aspirations, turning marriage into a strategic alliance rather than a personal union, and placing a profound restriction on her individual autonomy and aspirations. Number 3. Restriction on independent travel and movement. For women in the Byzantine borderlands of 730 Anno Domini, the freedom to travel independently or move unescorted in public spaces was severely curtailed, a restriction born of a blend of deeply ingrained social norms, the ever-present dangers of the frontier, and the prevailing patriarchal structure of society. The idea of a respectable woman venturing out alone, especially beyond the confines of her immediate village or city quarter, would have been considered scandalous, dangerous, and utterly inappropriate. Imagine a woman named Thalia, living in a small, isolated settlement along the Byzantine Arab frontier. If she needed to visit a neighboring village, perhaps to see a sick relative or attend a market, she would not simply set off by herself. Such a journey would be fraught with peril. Bandits, deserters, raiding parties from across the border, or even just wild animals. Her safety and reputation would demand that she be accompanied by a male relative, her father, brother, husband, or an elderly male servant. This escort provided not only physical protection but also maintained her social standing, signaling that she was a woman of repute under the protection of her family. Within the confines of her own town or village, a woman's movement was also largely restricted. While she might move freely within her household and its immediate vicinity, venturing into public spaces like the marketplace or the church typically involved a degree of modesty, and often especially for women of higher status, being veiled or accompanied. Unescorted women in public, particularly urban areas, could be mistaken for prostitutes or women of ill repute, leading to severe damage to their honor and that of their family. The social stigma attached to such unsupervised movement was a powerful deterrent. This restriction was particularly acute in the borderlands. These regions were characterized by constant instability. Raids were common, and communities lived under a perpetual state of alert. For women who were often considered vulnerable targets for abduction or enslavement during raids, limiting their unsupervised movement was seen as a crucial protective measure. It was not just about social propriety, it was about physical survival. Their confinement was a practical aspect of security, even for women with legitimate reasons to travel, such as visiting family in another city or making a pilgrimage. The journey would be meticulously planned and executed under the strictest guardianship. They would typically travel as part of a larger, well-protected caravan or group, with male escorts responsible for their safety and oversight. The very concept of a woman embarking on a solo journey for business adventure or independent exploration was unthinkable. This restriction was not explicitly codified in a single law, but was enforced by a powerful combination of social expectation, family honor, religious teaching that emphasized female modesty and seclusion, and the very real dangers of the external world. For women in the Byzantine Borderlands of 730 Anno Domini, their spatial freedom was heavily circumscribed, their movements largely dictated by the need for protection and the dictates of societal decorum, making independent travel a profound and largely unattainable aspiration. They were literally bound to their households and communities, their world often defined by their immediate surroundings. Number 2. Restriction on property, ownership and management. In the Byzantine Borderlands of 730 Anno Domini, the nuances of property ownership for women were a complex blend of legal rights and profound societal limitation. While Byzantine law, drawing heavily from its Roman predecessors, theoretically granted women the right to own, inherit, and even acquire property, the practical reality, especially in the volatile frontier regions, often meant their ability to manage or control this property independently was severely curtailed, almost always requiring male guardianship. Imagine a woman named Katerina, living in a fertile valley in Isauria, a rugged region where land was both precious and constantly contested. She might inherit land from her deceased father if she had no brothers, or a dowry from her husband's family upon marriage. Legally, this land was hers. However, if Katerina wanted to sell a portion of it, enter into a lease agreement, mortgage it, or engage in any significant financial transaction concerning her property, she could not simply do so on her own authority. She would typically need the consent and involvement of her male guardian, often her father, husband, or if widowed, a male relative or a court-appointed administrator. This was not merely a formality, it was a legal requirement grounded in the belief that women lacked the necessary acumen or experience for independent financial management in the public sphere. This reliance on male guardianship for property management meant that while women could accumulate wealth and land, their direct agency over it was often limited. The legal documents would usually require the signature or presence of the male guardian, essentially giving him veto power or at least significant oversight over her financial decision. In the borderlands, where property often included strategic land, livestock, or valuable resources, constantly at risk from raids or disputes, this external male control was likely even more pronounced. Patriarchal structure of society meant that property management was seen as a male responsibility, tied to a family's public standing and security. A woman's property, while legally hers, was often viewed as part of the broader family estate, which was ultimately managed by the male head. There were, of course, instances of powerful, often widowed women who did manage significant estates, especially if their sons were too young or absent. However, even these women often relied on male agents, stewards, or legal advisors to execute their decisions in the public domain. Their power was often exercised through careful delegation and their existing social networks rather than independent legal standing in the formal sense. Furthermore, the dowry system, a fundamental aspect of Byzantine marriage, complicated property rights. While the dowry was meant to remain the woman's property throughout the marriage, managed by her husband for their joint benefit, its return in cases of divorce or widowhood could be a contentious legal representation. The dower, property given by the husband to the wife, also had its own set of rules, often providing a form of financial security for the woman. But its management typically fell to the husband. Thus, while women in the Byzantine Borderlands of 730 Anno Domini held a theoretical right to property ownership, the practical day-to-day management control and transactional authority over that property were almost invariably subject to the oversight and consent of male guardians, fundamentally restricting their economic and consent of Magar in a world where land and restricting their economic and decision-making power. In a world where land and resources were everything, their ownership was often a right in name, while the power to truly wield it remained in male hands. Number 1. Restriction on public appearance and modesty. For women living in the Byzantine Borderlands during 730 Anno Domini, the rules governing public appearance and modesty were among the most pervasive and strictly enforced, shaping their daily lives from the moment they stepped outside their homes. These unwritten yet incredibly powerful societal expectations were a blend of Christian piety, inherited Roman customs, and the pragmatic need for social order and protection in a volatile frontier environment. Prevailing norm dictated that respectable women, particularly those of higher social standing, should be seen as little as possible in public, and when they were, their appearance should be modest, reserved, and devoid of anything that might draw undue attention. Imagine a woman named Zoe, a merchant's wife, in a bustling border town like Tarsus. If she needed to go to the marketplace, her attire would be carefully chosen. She would likely wear loose-fitting conservative clothing that concealed the shape of her body. For women of higher status, a veil or hood that covered her hair and often part of her face was a common expectation, a symbol of her modesty, her respectability, and her adherence to societal norms. This was not a universal law like a modern dress code, but a powerful social imperative that, if violated, could lead to severe damage to a woman's reputation and that of her entire family. The reasons for this emphasis on modesty were multifaceted. Religiously, it was tied to interpretations of Christian scripture that encouraged female humility and discouraged vanity. Socially, it was a marker of status. Women of lower classes, who might work in the fields or serve as laborers, often had less restrictive clothing requirements, but even for them, a certain decorum was expected. For respectable women, seclusion and discreet appearance were seen as safeguards of their honor and purity. In the tumultuous borderlands, this expectation of modesty and limited public appearance also served a very practical purpose. Constant threat of raids, abduction, and sexual violence meant that women were often targets. Being less conspicuous in public, or avoiding public spaces altogether, was a form of protection. Their presence in the public sphere was largely restricted to essential activities, like attending church services or purchasing necessities, and even then, often with an escort or in the company of other women. A woman drawing undue attention to herself through immodest dress or overly forward behavior risked not only social censure, but also physical danger. Furthermore, the separation of male and female spheres was a cornerstone of Byzantine society. Public world, the marketplace, the courts, the military, political gatherings was primarily a male domain. The domestic sphere, The household was the woman's realm. This physical and social separation was reinforced by expectations about appearance. Women were not meant to be active participants in the public arena in the same way men were, and their appearance reflected this subordinate domestic role. While there might be regional variations or differences based on social class, the overarching expectation across the Byzantine borderlands in 730 Anno Domini was that a woman's public presence should be minimal, discreet, and modest. A constant reminder of her prescribed place in a world largely dominated by men. Any deviation from these unwritten rules was not just a fashion choice. It was a profound social transgression that carried significant consequences, making it one of the most pervasive and restrictive rules shaping a woman's daily existence.